Okay, this is our part 4 of the urban geography lecture. But just to review where we are, we're looking at Borchert's study, and he talked about these eras, uh, periods of time in history before 1790, the colonial era when we had wagon roads and log turnpikes, and that led us into the 1790 to 1830, the sail and wagon era. Sail meaning those small coastal ships that carried a lot of goods. And the innovation then was the canals, starting in 1825 with the Erie Canal, which then impacted the following era. But in 1830 to 1870, as you know, the canals were very quickly put out of business. The canal era only lasted about 30 years or so. But 1830 to 1870 was the age of steam, when coal and steam engines became the source of power for factories, as well as steamboats on the rivers and lakes, and what were called the very early iron horse railroads that had different problems, like different gauges. When you get to a city, you had to switch all the goods, take all the goods off one train, put it on another, and so forth. In 1870 to 1920, during the steel era, really kind of the golden age of American industry and American manufacturing, coal was still the main source of power, but now we had cheap steel that allowed, machinery and locomotives to be built, as well as laying down the railroad tracks so we could crisscross the country with railroad tracks. We had big railroads now, standard gauge, skyscraper was invented, as well as the elevator. The gasoline engine was invented, but that affected the next era. And that next era was what he called the Auto-Air-Amenity age, which is the one we'll be talking about. We'll start off with today, from 1920 to 1980. And of course, these dates are all very approximate, but so that Auto-Air-Amenity age, which I erroneously listed as 1970 here, should be 80. But the major innovations, and I should make it a distinction between an innovation and an invention. It's like the automobile engine. The automobile engine was invented more or less really in the late 1800s. But an innovation means like it impacts society. So I imagine the same thing was true with computers, that, computers were invented and it was like people in factories fooled around with them for, 10 years or so before it spread across society and impacted how society functions. So that would be the stage when you can call it's an innovation rather than just an invention. But that brought us wide automobile ownership in this era. The automobile wasn't just a rich man's toy. I told you that, like the one doctor in town would have an automobile in his garage, and say in 1910 or so, and he'd drive it on Sundays and scare the dogs and horses, and everybody come out and watch him drive by. It wasn't until the 20s, when you've heard the story of Henry Ford and the Model T and the assembly line, when the price of automobiles came down enough. Plus, you had to have roads. You had to have. It's kind of like buying an electric car now. Buy an electric car because you think, where am I going to get fuel from? If I travel to Columbus, Well, the same thing was initially true with automobiles. Where are you going to buy gasoline? Roads weren't marked. We didn't really have good highway markings, really until more like the late 1920s or so. But we had national highways and then interstate highways. Construction on the interstate highways started in earnest in the 1960s. And other innovations, the refrigerated boxcars changed the distribution of dairying, meat processing, and agricultural locations. And we'll talk about that a bit more, of course, when we get into agriculture. But I just want to throw out the idea now that It wasn't until really you had refrigeration that Wisconsin could become the center of the dairy industry, because before that, all milk came from local dairy cows. You couldn't be located more than an hour away, or the milk would spoil. So anyway, once we had refrigerated boxcars, that allowed Wisconsin in particular to specialize as the center of the dairying industry. And similar things happened with the location of meat processing. It used to be that, if you're going to have beef, local farmers grew cows around Philadelphia or Boston or Baltimore or wherever it was. It wasn't until refrigeration that we get into the idea that areas farther west, closer to the grasslands, as we will see, could specialize in raising cattle. Then they could be processed, and then we could ship that meat and refrigerate it and so forth. And this idea that, and we'll see that over and over again with all kinds of, we'll give a couple of examples, but agricultural locations, I'll just toss it out now and we'll see. Let's even take something as the wheat belt. If you go back to the colonial era and you define the wheat belt, it really was just inland from the big cities along the coast. If people in Boston were going to eat wheat, it was going to come from, farms a days or two drive out, where, farmers would load up wagons and bring it in to be sold in the markets in Boston. In that case, it wasn't that the wheat or corn grains would spoil, but it was simply that it didn't pay you to, if you were going to ship grain from outside of Boston to, say, Baltimore, and it took you 2 weeks to get it down there, there's no way that would be economical. You'd have to pay. The cost, in a sense, was the guy driving that wagon for 2 weeks, plus feeding the horses for 2 weeks, and then getting back to Boston. So there was a tremendous expense in poor transportation in those days. But over time, that wheat belt migrated, and when the Erie Canal opened up, really upstate New York became our wheat belt. Particularly New England farmers were running out there buying land, growing wheat, shipping it by canal down to New York. Once it gets to New York, it could go by ship anywhere, really. And then, of course, when the railroads came along, that process even speeded up. And when the Erie Canal opened the Great Lakes, at 5 hours out from Chicago and Cleveland along the Great Lakes and Wisconsin cities and so on, started being the wheat belt. And this leads up really to the next bullet on here, the idea, in the same way that flexible oil and electricity replaced the need for coal. This idea of flexibility, that now we've reached the point where the entire nation is really, transportation is pretty much accessible to anybody, anywhere. Other than, if you're out in the middle of the desert or in a national park or something where you can't go in and build roads. And that allows agricultural crops to grow in the best places naturally, because it turns out, Boston used to grow wheat around Boston and Baltimore. Those are bad places to grow wheat. You'll never get good yields there. Wheat likes to grow in natural grasslands. So where are those? Those are out in the Midwest and the Great Plains. I'll show you a map of that. But those areas couldn't become the wheat belt until we had railroads out there, or barge traffic and steamboat traffic that could ship these grains to market. And just as this idea of flexibility in transportation means that the country now is crisscrossed with roads and railroads, and we can allow things like crops to grow in the best places for them naturally, rather than trying to grow corn and wheat poorly outside of Philadelphia and getting low yields. Now we can grow it in the best places, get high yields. And the same thing is true with this comment about flexible oil and electricity replaces the need for coal. Now that you could pretty much put electricity anywhere, if you wanted to, you could build a factory in northern Wyoming if you wanted to, assuming you could find labor. Um, that electricity is there, and the same thing is true with oil. Tanker trucks, you see them on the roads delivering gas to gas stations. Well, they can deliver fuel oil or diesel fuel to run machinery pretty much anywhere. And that's made a big difference from the previous eras, even back in the, certainly in the Iron Horse steam era, and then in the steel era, where you had to build your factory either on a railroad or on the coast where you could receive shipments of coal, because that was your only power source. There was no electricity in 1870. It hadn't been invented yet. So the third bullet, all of the USA was now accessible by transportation for timber, grazing, cropland. So all these activities finally settled in their best places. Same thing is true for timber. As the settlers settled in the East, we immediately began chopping down all the trees. And you go back to even around the time of the Revolution, almost all the trees on the East Coast had been chopped down, either for housing, for fuel, for furniture, exported, shipbuilding, masts sent back to England, and so on. Masts for ships. And now we can get lumber and timber from the West Coast, or we can get pulp. A lot of our pulp for newspaper and paper towels and stuff comes from the South, where trees grow on former cotton land, and it turns out they grow to be about 7 or 8 years. So it's almost like trees now, particularly in the South, are just like a crop, almost like Christmas trees. You plant them and you cut them down in 7 or 8 years, and then you replant them. So it's just like a crop, only instead of harvesting every single year, you harvest them every 7 or 8 years. But those things would not have been possible without a transportation network covering the whole country. In this Auto-Air-Amenity age, Borchert said that the heartland remained the earlier core, that is the North, as defined by the North of the Civil War, New England through the upper Midwest, like Michigan, Wisconsin, remember the Northwest Territories, and so on down to the Mason-Dixon line. Or if you think of it, if you're thinking of cities, it's like Boston, Chicago, say at this point probably Kansas City and Washington, D.C. And it wasn't that there weren't any other urbanization places undergoing urbanization. There were, but they were kind of like outlying regional centers. So we had Atlanta was developing, Houston in Texas, Denver, Los Angeles, and so on. But it wasn't like the whole core was spreading. Which, if we jump down to the bottom, the thing about I was talking about the glue set, that national urban pattern had kind of set. That's pretty much the big urbanized core, and other places develop, like Denver, Los Angeles, Houston, Seattle. But the heartland as a whole really isn't. It's not like it's continuing to spread out across the whole country. Now, you could argue, jumping back one bullet, that California has become a second core, or you could even say like the West Coast from Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Although you've seen in the population density maps we looked at, in those that map of population density that had the mountain peaks on it, they still remain kind of separate, rather than spreading, as they have not yet spread as much as megalopolis has and merged into each other. The hinterland, the area of new settlement in the Auto-Air-Amenity age, is the West Coast, Florida, the desert Southwest, that is Arizona, Nevada, particularly Las Vegas, New Mexico. Believe it or not, Alaska and Hawaii weren't even in the country until 1959. That's not all that long ago. Although I'll talk about Alaska in particular. you could argue that the real hinterland for this era, the Auto-Air-Amenity age era, was the suburbs, because that's where all the action was taking place. In the old days, they said go west. Now people say, let's go out in the suburbs. This was the era of tremendous expansion of the suburbs with the interstate highways and then ring roads around, beltways around many cities. And that changed. Wasn't only people moved, but when the people moved, the shopping moved and office parks developed. So the location of employment moves, and in fact, at this, for some of this period, cities started emptying out. It was like a donut. The whole was developing in the donut, and everybody was moving out. And inner cities had high vacancy rates. Downtown shopping. People, there used to be downtown department stores and so on, and now everybody was shopping out in the malls. So the interstates really reshaped urban centers. And by the way, I meant to mention to you when we were talking about it, even in the suburbs, you had suburban downtowns develop. A good example of that, and I should have mentioned this when we were talking about it before, is Easton in Columbus. That is a good example of an edge city or a suburban downtown, where literally you almost like recreated downtown. More so than, like, say, Polaris. Polaris is like just a big shopping mall, and there's a lot of shopping, box stores and so on. But in Easton, you actually tried to recreate. You have multi-story buildings and parking and decked, garage decked parking like you would see in a downtown. And they've tried to create like a little miniature downtown environment. That's a real edge city, or what some folks call a suburban downtown. So the suburbs shifted that urban center of gravity quite a bit, so to speak. And as I mentioned, led to declining population in central cities. Some people say suburban malls killed downtown shopping. Now, some downtowns have revitalized by creating a suburban type mall downtown, right? A Galleria, maybe it's a 3-story shopping mall. But again, it's almost importing that idea from the suburbs back into downtown. Office parks and industrial parks shifted employment away from central cities. And airports, because it is the auto-air-amenity age, not enough. It's not like, so far anyway, airplanes, unless we all come to that era where we all have our individual helicopter, we all commute to work by helicopter or something. Air isn't something, most people are not on an airplane every day. Air travel is something people do, a few times a year. So it hasn't reshaped our urban system pattern the same way these other innovations did. Although you do see it in some ways. We'll see it in terms of cities that have evolved manufacturing airplanes. Seattle is the best example with Boeing, and they employed thousands of people. And it's also true to some extent that cities, as a very general rule, cities grow towards their airports. I should say metropolitan areas grow toward their airports, because most airports can't fit inside the legal cities. So we're talking about metropolitan airports. So if you look at Columbus over time and you say, well, Columbus's airport is in the northeast sector of Columbus, over time stuff starts moving out in that direction, because you do have a lot of activity out there. I mean, you're going to have, FedEx is going to put a air cargo warehouse out there, and you're going to have restaurants, you're going to have hotels, of course, you're going to have convention centers, or in hotels if it's not a gigantic convention center. But there is some tendency for metropolitan areas to develop toward their airports. The amenity part of this, as you know by now, amenity means like the good things in life. Disamenity means the bad things, the Disamenity was, remember, the prisons, the sewage treatment plants, railroad tracks, and so on. For the first time, perhaps in the history of humans, um, though I suppose you could say that there were French kings or something that built resort towns up in a mountain or something. But the idea that we could develop entire cities just for fun was something new. And no longer was it a case that, well, this city grew up because it was a steel, had steel, iron ore and coal, and it was a port and so on. Now we could say, hey, I got an idea. Let's go out into this desert town and build gambling casinos, because we'll get this one state to liberalize its laws and allow gambling here, and then people will come from California and New York and so on. So we had initially Las Vegas. Of course, now that there's more states allow gambling and more states have casinos and so forth, Las Vegas is trying to keep changing its image to make it more of a family resort, which is why we have all the replicas of the Eiffel Towers and the pyramids and stuff in Las Vegas. Orlando, this is something new in the American and really in the world landscape, although it happens elsewhere now because we have Disneylands in Paris, we have Disneylands in Japan and so on. But the idea that you could have a city, kind of out in the middle of nowhere in Florida, called Orlando, that was in the center of the citrus. It was kind of a big citrus, and there's also a citrus capital, and there's also some livestock, stock, and horses there, and so on. But a metropolitan area, 350,000 people, and Walt Disney comes along and says, we're going to build this gigantic thing. And then the other, other imitators of Walt Disney have come in and built there, and all the Sea Worlds and zoo places and all this. So between 1960 and currently, I think it's 2013, Orlando is now 2.3 million people. So it's like grown 7 times, all because it's a fun place to go to. Or we can expand cities. These cities existed there already as small cities, but Phoenix and Tucson, simply because folks like the climate and they want to get out of the snow in Buffalo, so they move to Tucson and so on. We in our society, the society is wealthy enough, and folks are wealthy enough that they can afford to do this, and they can say, I'm going to move to Tucson just because I don't like the rain and the snow and so on. So I'm going to live there. So these cities evolve simply because of amenities. And of course, not just Arizona in this case, but Florida, and not just Orlando, but all of Florida has seen a lot of migration because of the better, warmer climate and for retirement and so on. Honolulu, building a city with 1 million people on an island. It's always, Hawaii has the highest cost of living in the U.S., which makes perfect sense when you think of it, because everything's got to be brought in by boat or plane. So somebody's got to pay for shipping all that stuff out there. So it costs. And sometimes it was said back to 1959 when Alaska and Hawaii came into states, Alaska was the last frontier, the new frontier. And it may be, but it's been out there since 1959 as a U.S. state, and its population is still only about, this is in 2014, its population is still only about 750,000 people. There are more people in Rhode Island than Alaska. Rhode Island's got like just about 1 million people. So, while it's experienced some relative growth, its population's probably doubled or more since it came in, but still, in 750,000, we have 2.3 million people in Orlando. So Alaska has a lot of room to grow if it's going to be the next frontier or new frontier. So I took here's a couple of shots from the web showing what Orlando looks like now. That's the top photo. And of course, this is the city of Orlando. I'm talking about Disney World. Of course, down the bottom, I'm sure you recognize Las Vegas. So in this auto-air-amenity age, we had boom cities, as in other eras, like Chicago. Part of Chicago's boom was manufacturing railroad equipment. Part of Cincinnati's boom was manufacturing steamboats and steamboat equipment. So now, of course, the classic city that grew up on the automobile was Detroit. And Detroit manufactured the automobiles, but the components spilled over and impacted other cities. Like Akron became the rubber capital of the world, manufacturing tires with Goodyear and Firestone, both based there. Other things happened, like recreational vehicles and mobile homes, particularly in northern Indiana. And it makes sense that those things, the manufacture of both RVs and mobile homes, are concentrated in the same area, because when you think of it, they're a very similar product. You know, an RV is like a mobile home on wheels, right? You get the chassis, you know, still have to be built, and the aluminum siding and so on that they put on these things. I mentioned Seattle got a big boost in its economy by having Boeing aircraft locate out there, because Boeing sells planes all over the world. And other smaller places like Wichita, Kansas, manufacturing Piper Cubs and corporate jets, small airplanes. Then, of course, also in the air age, we had the rocket ships, and of course, not many people have been up in a rocket, but we did have these space flight centers developed in Florida on the coast, and Cape, it used to be called Cape Canaveral, then was renamed Cape Kennedy, and also in Houston, which was Mission Control. Largely that went there, I think it was because that was when Lyndon Johnson was the president. He was steering stuff toward his home state of Texas. But in addition, this was the rise of the auto-structured cities. And I'll show you a map comparing, like, Boston is Boston and Phoenix. But the idea that cities that developed during the automobile era are shaped differently. They have different street patterns. They're different from the air than the older port cities. And this is another idea of Borchert's, that cities maintain a flavor of the era they were developed in. The narrow winding streets down along the port area that you see in Boston and Baltimore, as opposed to the wide, 2 and 4 lane streets for automobiles that you see in places like Los Angeles and Phoenix and Orlando, and cities that grew up later. And in fact, someone did a study, if you look down on Los Angeles from a satellite photo, 70% of the land in Los Angeles, which is a classic auto era city, is taken up by space for automobiles. So now you're talking, you have that you're looking down on a satellite photo, right? You get all the roads, you get everybody's driveway. Now add in all the land taken up by gas stations, used car lots, parking lots, and you see really how much of that space is taken up by the automobile. Again, in this case, 70%. And the same is true with other cities that evolved, even if they were founded much earlier. The question is, when did they experience their big boom and growth? If they experienced their big boom and growth during the auto era, then you get the places like Orlando, Las Vegas, Phoenix, and so forth. We did have some growth in southern cities at this time based on textiles and manufacturing, some of that moving out of the Northeast, particularly the cities that are in that Piedmont corridor, from Birmingham and northern Alabama, through Atlanta, and then through Charlotte, Raleigh, in the North Carolina, and so forth. And we had every era, just like you had coal cities that boomed during the era when everything was run on coal. Now that almost everything is being run on oil, we had a big boom in Texas. Dallas, Houston, the Texas, Louisiana Gulf Coast, not just on the oil, on the petroleum, but on the things that were made from petroleum, which is a lot of petrochemicals. And as you can see in this map, there's actually a lot of manufacturing, chemical and petrochemical manufacturing in many cities. But look at the particular concentration along the Texas, Louisiana, pretty much all of the Gulf Coast. Not extending too far into Florida, though there's a little bit of it in Tampa. And indeed, there's a lot of chemical plants around Ohio. If you've ever driven through New Jersey, the whole Garden State 995 strip is, but the big cluster is right down where the natural resources were the biggest amounts. Actually, petroleum drilling started really in the Appalachians. The first well was in Drake's oil well in western Pennsylvania, but the big deposits of it initially were in Texas, Louisiana, and that's where that petrochemical industry got its start. Now, like every other era, Borchert points out we have some cities in decline. The Rust Belt had already started at this point. We already had, in the 50s even, Pittsburgh was, was better coal elsewhere, better iron ore elsewhere. Some of those, competition from imports. Steel industry was moving to the Great Lakes cities and then to the East Coast. So the Rust Belt, as manufacturing declined, coal was not as much in demand with oil. Oil was being substituted for coal for some extent, but in addition, the eastern coal, particularly in Appalachia, a lot of that coal, the best coal had been removed. Basically, the coal that they were getting out of deep mines, guys with picks and shovels, and then, of course, later bigger machinery. But really, compared to the strip mines that were opening up out in the Dakotas and Wyoming, where, you could just scoop the stuff up on gigantic trucks and so on, started hitting the cities back in Appalachia and West Virginia and Pennsylvania in particular, and those cities started to decline. This was the start of the decline in that Buffalo, Cleveland, Wheeling triangle around Pittsburgh. That was particularly hard hit. And decline of agricultural towns in the Great Plains. Not because when people were eating less food. We were eating more and more food all the time. What happened, though, is you didn't need all those little towns because a lot of those smaller cities grew up in the era of horses. Right? It would take you were going to go 10 miles by horse. That was a whole day's trip. Now you can go 10 miles by car in, 20 minutes or whatever. So a whole level of the agricultural town hierarchy kind of dropped out. We didn't need all these towns anymore. We can get rid of all these little towns on every intersection and focus on bigger cities because the farmers could drive in for 45 minutes around. The other thing that sped along this decline was simply with mechanization, less and less and less of a need for farm workers. The figures that we're down to about 1% of the United States is employed in agriculture. That's phenomenal, when even in the 70s it was maybe like 20%. That's how quickly. So all those people, not having jobs for all those people has led to decline. And I'll show you, I don't know if it's the next map, but we'll see a map of population growth and decline. And here it is. You see, we won't go into this in a great amount of detail, but just showing this is between 2000 and 2010, the percent change in population, and basically the blues have gained people, so that could be the hinterland, right? So you see Metro DC, the Piedmont region, we've talked about all of Florida, and a lot of the West Coast, because there's, with a small population density to begin with in a lot of these states, 1,000 people moving in gives you a big growth rate. But look at the areas of decline. So you see this, I talked about this as a triangle, but this particular area is harder hit. In particular, this is showing percentages, but a lot of these places are bigger cities. I mean, Cleveland's a big city, Pittsburgh is big, even Wheeling, compared to some of the towns out here. But you do see, particularly on the Great Plains, through the two Dakotas and Nebraska and Kansas, and even in the Texas Panhandle, people say, "Well, Texas is booming." Yeah, it is if you're in the Texas Triangle, and there's my cursor. So if you're in Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, Houston, yes, you're booming. But Texas is a huge state, and notice that if you're out on the Great Plains of Texas, the agricultural part of Texas, things aren't looking good at all. Then you have this area called the Mississippi Delta, not to be confused with the actual delta of the Mississippi, which is here. But this is an area of very high African American population and still kind of in decline from the decline of agriculture. It's a very poor region of the United States in northern Louisiana, western Mississippi, and eastern Arkansas, all along the Mississippi River. By the way, notice here's Alaska. There's even large areas of Alaska with declining population, even in the over the last census decade. So 1980 to the present, the information age, which Borchert hinted at, but I basically added this to it because I'm sure Borchert would add it if he were redoing this, but because we really have entered into a different era, so to speak. But the innovations are computers, email, internet, World Wide Web. As Borchert would say, the heartland and hinterland are pretty much the same. The core area of the north and the dense cities there aren't moving out all that much. Instead, we're seeing islands, as we talked about. So that's the heartland and hinterland. We have the Silicon Valley. We have a new innovation, right? Computers. So we have cities booming because of and not so much the manufacture of the computers anymore, which is an intensive labor cost. So like textiles, that's gone overseas. So a lot of that stuff is simply assembled and manufactured overseas, particularly in China and Southeast Asia. But the software development, as we know, is creating booms for Silicon Valley, and there's kind of an East Coast Silicon Valley, which is around metropolitan Boston, and these software development regions have been helped by universities such as Stanford in the West Coast, in the case of Silicon Valley outside of San Francisco, and MIT and other institutions in Boston. And then we have software manufacturers like Microsoft, which helped Seattle boom again. We have some boom towns out west because of more the shift of coal, I'll say, from the eastern Appalachians to the west, as I mentioned before, bigger strip mines basically. And we have now a big boom in oil, oil towns in Wyoming and the Dakotas because of fracking, where they go into oil wells and you don't just drill now and let the oil flow out naturally, but you basically it's almost like you go in there and you kind of explode the layers that the oil is in, and that forces more oil out of the rock, liquefies more of the oil, and then you can get even more oil out of it. That's become a boom area for oil and coal. Computer and chip manufacturing has moved offshore. Now, to the extent that we get, and maybe it will be true in 50 years, that most people work from home, that will have a tremendous impact on where people locate, because you'll no longer have to live in metropolitan Columbus to make sure you can have a job. In theory, you could live in the woods of Idaho and do your thing by email and on the web and so forth. Now, we've seen, though, that folks like urban areas. Even if you could work from home, you're probably still going to want to be within commuting distance of an urban area, and you want to be within commuting distance of an airport and so on. So we'll see happens. What is happening is we do have a declining need for office space and retail space because of work at home, shop at home. We don't need. And every time you hear that, well, 10%, in the United States, people did 10% more of their holiday shopping on the web this year. It probably means, we're going to need 10% less of retail space in malls. And, a lot of malls are hard hit. A lot of malls have empty stores. In this, in fact, you'll see the video about retrofitting the suburbs, and it talks about that to some extent. There's a lot of abandoned malls, and then there's a whole issue. What are we going to do with all these abandoned malls now? And shopping on the web, of course, doesn't make things easier for them. You hear a lot about Silicon Valley. Well, here it is. It's basically outside of here's San Francisco Bay. There's the Golden Gate Bridge here, out to the ocean, and then the Oakland Bridge covers the inside, the one that partially collapsed during the earthquake they had some years ago. But anyway, it's basically at the southern part of San Francisco Bay, and it's centered around San Jose and Santa Clara. And here's a kind of impressionistic map, almost like an advertising map, showing all the different companies that are located out there on the right side of the screen. So a summary of Borchert's main points, which we've talked about, so I won't belabor it too much, but each transportation innovation changes the distribution of cities, from port cities, canal cities, railroad cities, interstate highway cities. You can think of it that way. And you can see the list of those innovations there. A city's structure retains a flavor of the era it grew up in. I believe the next slide is a map of Boston versus Phoenix, but you can just look at the road network and say, well, this must have been an old seaport rather than a city developed during the automobile age. As transportation innovation spread and as electricity arrived, city location became more and more flexible. You can locate a city anywhere now. Pretty much that was not true in the past. And think of this, remember, we're focusing on the US because I think it's more helpful to learn about something we know firsthand. But, we could be talking about the Congo and Africa and talk about, well, what's their extent of transportation flexibility? And it's not true. You can locate a factory anywhere. You would find very limited roadways, very limited railroads, very limited river transportation, and so on. So it's helpful to think about that other countries, and not in Europe. Europe is like the US. It's all interlaced with railroads and highway networks, and you can locate pretty much anywhere you want. Not true when you go to South America. Certainly not true when you go to Africa. Some cities grew up manufacturing the particular transportation innovation, whether Cincinnati steamboats, Chicago railroads, Detroit's autos, Seattle's airplanes, etc. And every transportation, often transportation's innovations, the fuel source changed, and that created a new reason for a boom. When everybody wanted coal cities boom. Now that everybody needs petroleum cities boom. If we, I don't know, if we all had little nuclear helicopters in our garage, I suppose we'd have a big boom in areas of the world that produce uranium. Here's that example of the difference in street maps. On the left is Boston, downtown near the waterfront. And you see the very intricate and confusing street patterns, as opposed to, here's a map of downtown Phoenix. There's the CBD, the peak land value, or whatever, what people would say, well, that's the center of downtown, and you see it's all nice highways that and wide streets and so on that go pretty much east west and north south.